There is a reason these words have reached you. Not your neighbor. Not the stranger 3 streets away. You. Somewhere inside your home, there is an object you call holy. You already know which one your eyes would go to first if you stood up right now and walked room by room. What you do with that knowledge will not be decided in this story. It will be decided in the silence between you and the Most High. Because heaven does not repeat a warning it has already spoken once with fire. If, as you read this, something tightens in your chest, a memory of a restless night, a corner of your house you avoid, a religious object you never really understood, do one simple thing. In your heart, whisper a single word, purify. Not as a slogan, not as a superstition, but as the first step of a ritual you will soon be asked to complete. From this moment on, you are no longer a distant observer of a strange Vatican story. You have been summoned into it. The warning that follows did not begin on a stage, or in a press conference, or in any of the loud places where the Church normally speaks. It began in darkness. Not the darkness of sin, but the darkness of a chapel late at night in Rome, where a frail pope sat before the tabernacle and realized that a light had gone out, not in the sanctuary lamp, but in the hearts of his people. Or, worse, that the light had not gone out at all. It had been smothered beneath something that looked sacred and felt safe, and was neither. There are objects that enter our homes proudly through the front door, wrapped as gifts from pilgrimages, bought at shrines, carried back from cathedrals. They are placed on shelves and mantels with care, surrounded by candles and flowers, trusted without question. And there are objects that slip in quietly through the cracks we leave when we stop keeping watch. A quick online purchase. A bargain table at a shop that smelled of incense but not of prayer. A figurine we once thought pretty, that we never thought to bless. Both kinds of objects can end up in the same place. Between you and God. In the final months of his pontificate, Pope Leo XIV began to see a pattern that terrified him more than any headline or scandal. Across dioceses and continents he heard the same complaints whispered to priests, written in desperate letters, confessed by weary souls. Prayer had become cold. Homes felt tense and strangely heavy. Children woke from dreams they could not explain. Families who still went to Mass found that the presence of God felt distant, as if their houses had been gently sealed from the inside. He traced these stories, one by one, like threads leading back to an unseen knot, until the knot appeared in his own hands. In a discourse delivered to a small gathering of bishops, a talk that was never released to the world, never added to any official document, and yet still echoes in the corridors where secret things are remembered, Pope Leo XIV lifted a simple religious object before them. The kind you have seen in 1,000 homes. The kind you may own right now. This, he said, voice trembling not from age but from the weight of what he had come to know, is not mere decoration. It is a doorway. Not a doorway carved by overt evil. A doorway carved by emptiness. He was not speaking of crude idols carved for pagan altars. He was not speaking of blatantly occult symbols or obvious instruments of sin. And he was not speaking of televisions, cell phones, or any of the usual suspects we love to blame for the collapse of our interior life. Those are noisy enemies, frontline distractions that parade their intentions in the open. No, the object he warned about is far more subtle, far more religious, and therefore far more dangerous. He spoke of the statues, images, and icons that flood the market today. mass-produced in factories where profit drowns out prayer, stamped out by hands that do not know the God whose face they pretend to sculpt, sold in shops that mix rosaries with charms, holy cards with crystals, crucifixes with amulets promising luck and protection. He spoke of those religious images that have never felt the touch of consecrating hands, never been lifted in blessing by a priest, never been soaked, even once, in the tears of a heart truly repentant. Objects that carry the names of saints, yet bear almost nothing of their spirit. Copies of copies of copies, until nothing is left but a shell. These are not windows opening your home to heaven. They are mirrors with the glass shattered, reflecting only your own desire to seem devout without the cost of actual conversion. They calm the conscience. They do not change the heart. And where there is an imitation of holiness without the reality, where a symbol claims to contain grace it has never received, there is a vacuum. And spiritual vacuums do not stay empty for long. That, Pope Leo XIV insisted, is why such objects have seeped into nearly every Catholic dwelling. Not because the faithful are wicked, but because they stop discerning. Because we learn to buy religious comfort the way we buy a chair or a painting, according to price, style, convenience. Because we assume that anything shaped like a cross must surely be safe. We stopped asking the old questions. Where did this object come from? Was it made under the shadow of prayer or under the shadow of profit? Has it ever truly been blessed, or has it simply been displayed? Our ancestors knew better. The living tradition of the Church taught that nothing should cross the threshold of a consecrated home without being examined, purified, and set apart in God's name. Every object was either welcomed as a vessel of grace or sent away as a stranger. We forgot that. We forgot the ritual of purification. And so, with the best of intentions and the worst of discernment, we opened 1,000 small doors in the walls of our own houses. Pope Leo XIV saw those doors. He saw the numbness in prayer, the unrest in Christian homes, the strange heaviness that clung to families who still clutched their rosaries and still knelt at Mass. And he followed it all back to the simplest, most unsettling truth of his pontificate. It began with an object on a private altar. With a cardinal who could no longer feel God. With a single night in a silent chapel, when heaven seemed to step back and let him feel the emptiness he had allowed in. That is where this story truly begins. With the last months of a dying pope, a hidden investigation in the heart of the Vatican, and a warning he believed could either suffocate or save the spiritual life of every home that heard it. Quick moment, subscribe now. It helps the channel grow and guarantees you never miss the next release. In those last months, Pope Leo XIV had the look of a man whose body had surrendered but whose mind refused to lie down. He moved slowly through the apostolic palace, his steps measured, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were sharper than ever. Aides assumed he was preoccupied with the usual burdens of the papacy, documents, meetings, crises. They were half right. The papers on his desk were official. The burden beneath them was not. When others slept, he read. Ancient manuscripts. The writings of Teresa of Avila on false consolations. John of the Cross on attachments that masquerade as devotion. Alphonsus Liguori on sacramentals and the necessity of blessing. Letters from monasteries. Reports from parish priests. Private notes scribbled in the margins of spiritual directors' journals. Different hands. Different centuries. The same unease. Across the world, a strange drought had settled on souls who should have been overflowing. It was subtle at first, the way true spiritual problems often are. Priests wrote of parishioners who came faithfully to Mass but confessed that their prayers felt like talking into a dead telephone line. Parents described homes that were not outwardly broken but carried an invisible weight, a heaviness in the air, small irritations that exploded into disproportionate arguments, children who woke in the night with cries they couldn't explain. The Pope read everything. One evening, as the sun bled out over St. Peter's and the square below melted into shadow, Leo closed yet another letter from a bishop who had written in frustration rather than pious formula. They have more images and symbols in their homes than ever, the bishop had written, and yet their hearts are colder than those who own nothing at all. Something is wrong. I can sense it. I cannot name it. The Pope leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He had seen the same thing. He knew families who had turned their living rooms into miniature shrines, walls covered in saints and crucifixes, shelves crowded with statues and devotional objects. And yet when he visited, he felt nothing of the warm, quiet presence that once seeped almost naturally from homes consecrated by genuine faith. It was as if he was standing in a museum of religion rather than an altar of living grace. Dead prayer. Divided homes. Disturbed nights. The three signs returned to him again and again like a litany. Not shouted. Whispered. He scribbled them onto a small piece of paper, circled them, and wrote a single word above them all: why? Days passed. His strength waned. The question did not. He asked his confessors what they were hearing. He asked his theologians what they were reading. He asked bishops, quietly, almost casually, what they sensed in their flocks when they visited homes and parishes. Not the statistics. The atmosphere. The answers converged. Prayer was being said, but not lived. Families were staying together under the same roof, but not truly united. People clung to religious objects as if they were talismans, yet were rarely moved to real repentance, real conversion, real surrender. Somewhere, something was replacing God with the appearance of God. It was during one of these late-night reviews, stacks of reports spread across his desk, the lamps burning low, that a name appeared again and again in the margins of private notes: Cardinal Martino. Not in scandal. In concern. His preaching has gone cold, one priest wrote. His eyes no longer shine when he speaks of the Eucharist, noted another. He avoids long conversations about prayer, remarked a spiritual director. These were not accusations. They were observations. And for a pope who had known Martino for decades as a man of sincere fervor, they struck a nerve. Leo set down his pen. Spiritual dryness happens even to the saints. He knew that. But this was different. There was a pattern to it. Martino's outward life was unchanged, dutiful, disciplined, punctual. Yet those closest to him sensed something missing, something withdrawn. The Pope asked for him. The summons arrived late one evening. Cardinal Martino was in his private oratory when the knock came, a quiet knock, the kind used by those who already know they are interrupting something sacred. Martino had been staring at the tabernacle for nearly an hour, lips moving, mind wandering. The words of his prayer rolled out of him by habit, but his heart felt like stone. He was not angry with God. He was not in mortal sin. He was simply empty. He rose, slightly annoyed with himself for feeling relief at the interruption. The messenger bowed and delivered the brief request the Holy Father would see him in his private study. Tonight. Martino straightened his cassock, ran a hand over his tired face, and felt a flicker of unease that had nothing to do with protocol. He had served under this pope long enough to know that Leo did not call men at such hours for trivial reasons. The corridors of the Vatican were quieter at night than most people imagine. The electric lights hummed softly. Somewhere distant, a clock chimed the hour. Martino's footsteps echoed more loudly than he liked as he approached the familiar door. He knocked. A faint voice invited him in. The Pope was alone. No secretaries, no advisors, no notaries. Only a single lamp illuminated the desk and a crucifix on the wall behind him. His face looked thinner than the last time Martino had seen him, the skin almost translucent, but his eyes were bright, almost feverishly so. "Eminence," Leo said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Thank you for coming." Martino bowed, kissed the fisherman's ring, and Saturday. There was a moment of silence, one of those uncomfortable silences that isn't quite empty, but charged, as if both men were standing on opposite sides of a truth neither had yet named. "I will not ask how you are," the Pope said gently. Martino forced a tight smile. "Your Holiness, I assure you, my health. I did not mean your body." The words cut through the air with surgical precision. The Cardinal swallowed. Leo leaned forward, resting his frail hands on the desk. "Martino," he said quietly, "do you still sense him? When you stand at the altar, when you sit in your oratory, when you kneel before the tabernacle in the night, do you still recognize the presence that once burned in your chest?" For a heartbeat, the old reflex rose in Martino, the instinct to answer as expected, to reassure the Holy Father, to maintain the smooth appearance of spiritual stability. But lying to God was useless, and lying to this Pope felt dangerously close to the same thing. He exhaled. Less and less, he confessed. "I perform the rites. I preach the doctrine. I keep the hours. But it is as if I am speaking into a void. I know he hears me, and yet I don't feel that I am heard." The Pope closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words pained him physically. "You are not alone," he said. "There are many like you. Too many. It is not simply a personal trial. It is a sign." Martino frowned. "A sign of what, Holy Father?" Leo opened his eyes and fixed them on Martino with a gaze that seemed to search past his face, past his clothes, past his titles, straight into the room where he prayed each night. "Tell me," the Pope asked softly, "what stands between you and the tabernacle in your private oratory?" It was such an odd question that Martino almost laughed. "Between me and the tabernacle," he repeated. "Yes," Leo said. "When you kneel, when you look at him, what is directly in your line of sight? Something hangs there. Something sits there. What is it?" Martino's mind flicked briefly to his oratory. He saw the small wooden altar, the candle, the tabernacle, and above it, or just to the side, a small image, he said slowly. "An icon. I bought it years ago, at a shop near the train station. It reminded me of a painting my mother had in our house. I placed it near the tabernacle. It comforts me. At least, it used to. The Pope nodded, as if he'd expected the answer. Did you have it blessed? Leo asked. Martino blinked. No, Holy Father. I never thought. It is only an image. Only an image, the Pope repeated, almost to himself. Only an image. The room felt colder. Eminence, he said at last, there are objects that dress themselves in holiness but carry no soul. They do not reflect heaven, only the emptiness of the hands that shaped them. I have read your reports. I have heard the confessions of your priests. I have listened to the cries of the faithful. I believe you may have allowed one such object into the place where you are most vulnerable. Martino felt his chest tighten. With all respect, Holy Father, he began carefully, are you suggesting that this little icon? I am suggesting, Leo interrupted gently but firmly, that you must test it. Not with superstition. With obedience. The word landed like a weight. What would you have me do? Martino asked. The Pope's voice lowered, as if someone could be listening beyond the door. Tonight, he said, when the palace is quiet and no one watches you, go to your oratory. Take that image, only that one, and bring it before the Blessed Sacrament. Place it directly between yourself and the tabernacle. Ask for nothing except the truth. That is all. Martino asked, simultaneously relieved and unsettled. That is everything, Leo replied. If it is merely wood and paint, you will lose nothing. If it is something else, if it has been allowed to stand as a substitute for the living God, you will know. Not by visions. Not by voices. By absence. Absence, Martino repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth. The Pope nodded. Come back to me when you have done this. Tell me what you experienced. Do not be afraid to speak plainly. You will not scandalize me. I have already seen more than you imagine. They spoke a little longer, not of doctrine, but of the old traditions of blessing, of the duty to discern what entered a consecrated space, of how easily the faithful now bought religious objects without asking where they came from or what they carried. When Martino finally left, the corridors felt different. He walked back to his quarters with the peculiar awareness of a man who has been told that the most ordinary detail of his life might be the key to a question he never managed to form. The oratory was dark when he entered. He did not light the lamp immediately. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust to the faint glow of the sanctuary candle. The familiar outline of the small altar emerged from the shadows. The tabernacle. The crucifix. The kneeler. And there, just to the side, the little image. How many times had he glanced at it without really seeing it? It had become part of the scenery of his prayer, a gentle presence he did not examine. A comfort, he'd called it. He approached slowly, his heart beat louder than his footsteps. Up close, the imperfections of the image were more obvious, the features slightly distorted, the colors too bright, the expression almost sentimental. It looked sacred in the way that souvenirs look sacred, almost. He hesitated, then reached out and took it in his hands. The wood was cool. Lighter than he remembered. For a brief moment, He felt foolish. Was he really doing this? Testing an image as if it were some kind of suspect? Yet the memory of the Pope's eyes held him steady. Obedience, not superstition. Martino carried the image to the chapel where the Blessed Sacrament was reserved. The corridor was empty. The building seemed to be holding its breath. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind him with a soft click. The chapel was small, lined with simple wooden pews. The only light came from the red lamp burning beside the tabernacle. It flickered gently, casting long shadows that stretched and retreated across the floor. He walked down the center aisle, the image held against his chest. At the altar, he knelt. For a moment he did nothing. Just breathed. Then, with deliberate care, he placed the image on the ledge before the tabernacle, exactly at eye level, so that if he looked straight ahead, he would see it first, blocking the small golden door behind it. He folded his hands. And for the first time in a long time, he did not speak. He simply waited. At first, nothing happened. The same familiar numbness sat in his chest. The same dull awareness that he was in a holy place without feeling much holiness. He almost relaxed. Perhaps this had all been an exercise in pious overcaution. Perhaps the Pope's fears were misplaced. Perhaps. The air shifted. He could not have said how. There was no sound, no visible change, no sudden gust of wind. But the room felt thinner. As if something had stepped back. As if a presence he had taken for granted had politely withdrawn to a distance he could no longer touch. The hair on his arms rose. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Even the rote phrases, the ones he could usually recite without effort, fell apart in his mind like ash. The silence pressing on him was not peaceful. It was vacant. He stared at the small image in front of him. The painted eyes stared back, glossy and lifeless. A chill slid down his spine. All at once, the memories crashed over him, years of kneeling in this chapel, the gradual cooling of his prayer, the way his gaze had often rested more easily on the image than on the tabernacle itself. Had he slowly transferred his trust to a thing because it was tangible, manageable, safe? His throat tightened. "Lord," he whispered, the words scraping out of him, "if I have placed something between us, show me." The silence deepened. And in that deepening, he understood with a clarity that felt like judgment and mercy in the same breath. He had not worshipped the image. He had not bowed to it as a god. But he had allowed it to stand in the space where only God should stand. He had allowed it to become the face he looked at when he no longer dared to look directly into the invisible presence behind the tabernacle. Tears stung his eyes. With trembling hands, Cardinal Martino reached up, took hold of the image, and lifted it away from the tabernacle, out of the line between himself and the Eucharistic Lord. The moment the space cleared, the heaviness cracked. It was not dramatic. No thunder, no visions, no voices. Just the sudden, unmistakable return of warmth in his chest, the soft, almost inaudible sense of someone leaning toward him again. The absence was over. The presence was back. He pressed the image to his chest, choking on something like shame. "Forgive me," he whispered, not to the wood in his hands, but to the God he had unknowingly eclipsed. "I did not know what I was doing." That night, in a small Vatican chapel no one else entered, a simple act of removal tore open the first thread of a veil that had lain over countless homes. And while the candle burned steadily before the tabernacle once more, far above, in his study, Pope Leo XIV waited to hear what the cardinal would say. He already suspected the answer. The true scope of the warning, the nun who had prayed for decades in silence, the secret council of bishops, the ritual of purification that would quietly pass from hand to hand, would all unfold from this moment. But it began here, with an aging pope who would not ignore what he saw. A cardinal kneeling before an unnaturally empty silence, and a single religious object removed at last from where it never should have stood. What happened in that small Vatican chapel did not stay there. By morning, the image that had once rested above Cardinal Martino's private tabernacle sat wrapped in plain cloth in his trembling hands as he waited outside the Pope's study. He felt lighter inside, yes, but also exposed, as if the removal of the object had peeled away a layer of polite distance between himself and God, leaving rawness where composure once lived. The door opened. An aide nodded him in. Pope Leo XIV looked even weaker than the night before. The skin under his eyes was darkened, his shoulders stooped, but there was a peculiar brightness in his gaze, the kind of light found in a man who has finally seen the outline of something he has been groping toward in the dark. "Well?" the Pope asked softly. Martino did not sit. He simply loosened his grip on the wrapped object and placed it on the desk between them, like evidence. "When I set it before the tabernacle," the cardinal said, voice rough, it was as if he stepped back. Not in anger. In respect. As if he would not compete with what I had placed between us. Leo did not look surprised. Only deeply sad. "And when you removed it?" he asked. The warmth returned, Martino whispered. Not emotion. Presence. I realized then, his throat tightened. I realized I had been looking at this more than him. Trusting it to make me feel devout when I no longer had the courage to be devout. He covered his face with both hands. "I am a prince of the church," he said hoarsely. "And I built myself a small idol." The Pope let the words hang in the air. At last, he spoke. "The Lord has been merciful to you," he said. "He allowed you to feel the absence so that you might recognize the counterfeit comfort you had accepted in its place." He rested his fingers lightly on the wrapped object, then withdrew them as if it were something fragile and contaminated at once. "This is not finished," Leo murmured. "If this is what happens in a small private chapel, what happens when such objects stand in places where heaven has chosen to speak with particular clarity?" Martino frowned. "What do you mean, Holy Father?" The Pope's eyes lifted, seeing something beyond the room. "There is the Chapel of the Apparitions," he said. "You know it. Everyone in the Vatican did. A small Marian chapel, tucked away from tourists, where generations of popes had gone to pray when they needed to listen more than to speak. Stories, never made official, always whispered, told of lights, of interior locutions, of moments when the Mother of God had made her presence unimaginably close there. Leo looked back at Martino. "Take it there," he said. The cardinal felt the floor tilt. "You would bring this thing into that place?" "For judgment," the Pope replied quietly. "Not by you. Not by me. By him." He held Martino's gaze. If this object is truly empty, if it carries no grace, if it stands as a false window to the divine, then let us place it where the light has always been clearest. Let us see what the light reveals. Martino swallowed, nodded, and took the cloth-wrapped image back into his arms. The chapel of the apparitions was even smaller than the cardinal remembered. He entered alone. The air inside was cooler than the corridor, and still, so still that the faint click of the door closing behind him sounded almost profane. A single statue of Our Lady stood to the side, modest and ancient, its paint worn smooth by the centuries. Before the tabernacle, the sanctuary lamp burned steadily. Martino approached the altar with slow, measured steps. He unwrapped the object. The factory-made image looked cheap under the chapel's soft light, like a counterfeit coin placed among relics of gold. The colors were loud, the expression sweet in a way that did not belong in this place. It felt foreign. He knelt, holding it in both hands. "Lord," he whispered, "I submit this to you. If it is merely wood and paint, let it be as nothing. If it has become a doorway to anything that is not from you, close it now." With that, he stood, went to the very edge of the sanctuary, and placed the image at the feet of the monstrance, directly beneath the hidden host. Then he stepped back, knelt again, and lifted his eyes. The change was immediate. The air chilled as if someone had opened an unseen door to a winter corridor. The skin on his arms prickled. The candle beside the tabernacle flickered, then dimmed, not extinguished, but as if its flame had been wrapped in thin shadow. Worst of all was not what he felt. It was what he did not feel. The presence, that quiet, constant someone whose nearness he had taken for granted even in his dryness, withdrawn. Not gone, but veiled. Not angry, but distant. Martino's heart lurched. He tried to speak a simple prayer, "My Lord and my God," but the words fell flat inside him, like stones dropped into a well with no echo. He stared at the incongruous little image at the foot of the monstrance and felt suddenly sick. It did not glow with evil. It did not move or twist or manifest anything dramatic. It just sat there, falsely holy, occupying a place it had not earned, claiming a reverence it did not deserve. In that moment, the cardinal saw his own soul in it. Mass-produced piety. Unquestioned habits. The shape of devotion without its fire. Tears blurred his vision. "I trusted you," he whispered, not to the object, but to the comfort it represented. "I hid behind you. I let you stand where only God should stand." The weight of years pressed down on him, years of cold prayer, mechanical preaching, a slow retreat from the fierce intimacy he had once known with the Lord. And all the while, this smiling, hollow thing had watched from above his tabernacle, offering him the illusion that nothing had changed. Something broke. Cardinal Martino bowed his head to the floor, his forehead touching the stone, and wept. Not the dignified tears of a tired cleric, but the wrenching sobs of a man who realizes he has quietly betrayed the only love that ever truly claimed him. "I am sorry," he choked. "I am so sorry. I chose the shadow because I was afraid of the light." He did not know how long he stayed there. At last, with a kind of trembling resolve, he rose to his knees, reached out, and took the image away from the monstrance, cradling it as one might carry a wounded thing to its burial, not out of affection, but out of respect for the damage it had done. The moment it left the altar, the candle brightened again. The chill eased. The silence filled, not with noise, but with that impossibly gentle pressure that says, "I am here." Martino pressed a hand to his chest, overwhelmed. This time the tears that came were different. "Thank you," he whispered, "for stepping back so I could see, and for stepping close when I finally moved aside what did not belong." The realization burned into him: the object had never carried grace. He had carried it, like an idol in his own heart, letting it stand as a proxy for the God he no longer dared to encounter in his full, unsettling reality. That chapel became the hinge of his life. And far away, in a place that had never seen Rome and never would, another soul was being led to the same revelation. The monastery had no name that mattered to the world. It sat on a hill where the wind always seemed to be praying, its stone walls worn by weather and whispered Hail Marys. Inside those walls lived a woman the church knew only as Sister Magdalena, a nun whose vocation had lasted 43 years and whose consolation had abandoned her for almost as long. She followed the rule. She kept the hours. She did her work in the kitchen, the laundry, the garden. She was not a rebellious sister. She did not question the church. She did not chase novelties. She simply did not hear God. Not in any way her heart could recognize. The younger sisters admired her discipline. The older ones pitied her quiet. Only her confessor knew how deep the silence went. "It is like praying into a wall," she had once told him, eyes downcast. "I know he is there. But I feel nothing." "For years, Father. Decades. Persevere," he had said gently. The saints endured dryness. She had nodded, obedient, and gone back to her cell, and knelt by the same little wooden shelf where she had knelt for 4 decades, and looked up at the same small statue of Our Lady that had always stood there. She had bought it as a young novice from a shop in the town far below the monastery. The shop had smelled of incense and perfume and something less nameable. The shelves had displayed rosaries beside amulets, saints beside angels with suspiciously vague names, Bibles beside books on energy and light. But the statue was pretty. The face soft. The colors gentle. She had not asked for it to be blessed. Life had swept forward. The statue had been placed on the shelf. Time had gathered around it like dust. One night, many years after her profession, Sister Magdalena found herself unable to sleep. The other sisters snored gently in their cells. The corridors were dark. The chapel, when she passed by, was empty. She felt an ache in her chest so old it had become almost nameless. She went to her cell. Kneeling on the worn spot in the floor, she folded her hands mechanically and began her usual prayers. The words dragged. The silence pressed. Then, in that silence, something happened that had not happened in so long she almost did not recognize it. A thought rose in her heart that did not sound like her own. "Look at what you have placed between me and you." The words were not audible, but they were clear enough to make her stop mid-prayer. She lifted her eyes. They went, as they always did, first to the statue. The gentle painted face smiled back at her, frozen in porcelain kindness. She stared at it. Memories surfaced, the shop, the crystals, the amulets. The way the owner had assured her that everything here is blessed with a wink that did not feel like faith. The fact that she had never, in all these years, asked a priest to bless the little figure. She had simply assumed. Look at what you have placed between me and you. The phrase pulsed again inside her, more insistent now. Her hands trembled. Mother, she whispered, unsure whether she was addressing the statue or the real woman whose image it claimed to bear, if you are truly from him, I will not remove you. But if you are only paint and habit and human comfort, then I must. She reached up. The statue felt heavier than it looked. When she lifted it off the shelf, a strange emptiness seemed to spill into the space it had occupied, as if the void it represented had finally become visible. She did not smash it. She did not curse it. She carried it quietly down the corridor, past the sleeping cells, to a small storage room where unused furniture was kept. There, on an unadorned table, she set it down. You will stay here until I know what you are, she said softly. Then she went back to her cell. The shelf above her kneeler was bare. For the first time in 43 years, when she knelt, there was nothing to look at but the invisible God. She pressed her forehead to the wood. Lord, she said, voice shaking, if I have hidden from you behind that image, forgive me. If I have loved the feeling of being devout more than you yourself, forgive me. If I have placed anything, between your gaze and my heart, take it away. The silence that met her was not the old, suffocating kind. It felt expectant. Then, like the first breath after being underwater too long, she sensed him. No thunder. No visions. Just a sudden, overwhelming awareness of being seen. Not as a good nun, not as a failure, not as a case study in spiritual dryness, but as a daughter who had wandered through a long interior night and was finally turning her face toward the faintest line of dawn. Tears poured down her cheeks. Now you are free. The words unfolded inside her with such tenderness that she sobbed aloud. They were not reproach. They were release. She spent the rest of the night in prayer, and for the first time in decades, the hours did not drag. They disappeared. When the bell rang for Lauds, her eyes were swollen, her knees sore, her heart alive. In the days that followed, the other sisters noticed the change. Sister Magdalena sang again. Her laughter, once rare and thin, returned in small, bright bursts at the most unexpected moments. Her eyes, which had grown dull over the years, now carried a quiet light. Eventually, she told the prioress everything. They went together to the storage room. The prioress looked at the statue long and hard, then said simply, "We will not keep what was never truly given to him." They did not throw it into fire like a pagan idol. They carried it out of the monastery grounds and left it where it could do no more harm, whispering prayers of protection over the place it had once occupied. Word of Sister Magdalena's resurrection reached their confessor. He wrote to his bishop. The bishop, already troubled by similar stories, added her account to a growing file and sent it, with a heavy heart, to Rome. It arrived at the desk of Pope Leo XIV and joined the others. The hidden drawer in the Pope's study was almost full. Reports from parish priests. Letters from monasteries. Confidential notes from spiritual directors. Private confessions from bishops who dared not speak of their dryness in public. Each document was different. The pattern was the same. Homes filled with religious objects yet strangely starved of God. Chapels adorned with images that had never been blessed, never been prayed before. Families who slept beneath crucifixes and woke from nightmares. Children who pointed to certain statues and said, "I don't like it. It looks wrong." The Pope read them all. Beside these letters lay older texts, Teresa of Avila warning her nuns not to clutter their cells with images bought in markets without discernment. John of the Cross teaching that a soul attached to a spiritual object more than to God himself has simply traded one idol for another. Alphonsus Liguori writing that sacramentals without blessing are empty forms, not channels of grace, frames without a picture, doors without a house behind them. The saints had seen the danger coming. The modern world had simply given it factories. Leo exhaled slowly and closed the drawer. The time for quiet collecting was over. The hall where he gathered them was small and windowless. 20 bishops sat around a long wooden table, candlelight softening the lines of worry on their faces. They had been summoned with little explanation, only a note written in the Pope's own hand: "Your presence is required for a matter concerning the spiritual safety of the faithful." Pope Leo XIV entered slowly, leaning more heavily than ever on his staff. The room rose. He blessed them, bid them sit, and took his place at the head of the table. Before him sat a small wooden box. He rested his hand on it. "Brothers," he said, voice steady despite the strain in his breathing, "I have called you here not to discuss doctrine, or discipline, or public scandal. What we will speak of tonight will likely never appear in any official document. And yet I believe it touches the root of why so many of our people live surrounded by sacred symbols yet starved of the sacred." He opened the box. Inside lay the object. Simple. Harmless. The same type of image that had once stood over Cardinal Motino's tabernacle, the same kind that had infiltrated Sister Magdalena's cell, the same category of religious decor that lined the walls of millions of homes. Several bishops shifted uncomfortably. Some recognized it too quickly. "This," the Pope said quietly, lifting it so all could see, "is not decoration. It is a doorway. Not by malice, but by emptiness. And emptiness invites what does not come from above." He let the words sink in. "I am not speaking of idols," he continued. "I am not speaking of explicit occult objects. I am speaking of those images and statues that wear the shape of holiness but have never been consecrated by holy hands, never been prayed over, never been born out of true faith. They trick good souls into believing they are protected when, in truth, they are simply unguarded." He set the image down. "In my drawer," he said, "I have testimonies from priests, from monasteries, from families across the world. Spiritual dryness. Tension without cause. Disturbing dreams. Children oppressed. Again and again, the pattern appears. When these unconsecrated objects are removed and the home is blessed anew, the heaviness lifts. Not because of magic. Because the false has been taken down and the true has been invited in." Silence. Some bishops looked pale. One cleared his throat. "Holy Father, are you saying we must tell the faithful to destroy all their images?" "No," Leo replied firmly. "I am saying we must teach them to discern." He folded his hands. "There is an ancient practice we have forgotten, a simple, fourfold way of guarding the threshold of the home." He spoke the words slowly, like steps in a path. "Examine. Confess. Remove. Consecrate." He looked around the table. "Examine," he said. Look honestly at what hangs on your walls, what sits on your shelves, what stands near your altars. Where did it come from? Was it made in the light of prayer, or in the shadow of commerce and superstition? Confess. Acknowledge before God if you have placed more trust in the object than in the one it claims to represent. Admit any attachment to appearances of devotion without the substance. Remove anything that cannot be trusted, anything that carries confusion, anything that your spirit recoils from when you truly listen. Take it away from the place of prayer. Do not honor what has not been truly offered to Him. Consecrate. Bless what remains. Invite a priest to bless the home. Ask the Lord Himself to claim every corner, every wall, every image, every symbol. Let the house become again what it was meant to be, not a museum of religion, but a dwelling for His presence. He paused, letting the 4 words root themselves in their minds. This is the ritual of purification, he said softly. Not a superstition. A return to what our ancestors knew instinctively, not everything that shines carries light. When the meeting ended, the bishops did not leave with policy documents or press statements. They left with a weight. Some thought of their cathedrals. Others thought of the gift shops outside their shrines. A few thought uneasily of their own private chapels, where objects of uncertain origin had crept in over the years, accepted without question. All of them understood that something unseen had been allowed to walk through the front door of the church, and that closing it would require more than a memo. As the ritual began to spread quietly, from bishop to priest, from confessor to penitent, from homily to household, the signs intensified. Families who had long ignored the strange heaviness in their living rooms suddenly noticed it. Arguments that seemed to erupt out of nowhere began to follow a pattern, always in the same room, always beneath the same image. Mothers found their children waking repeatedly at night, pointing to a corner where a statue stood and saying, "I don't like it there. It feels angry." Elderly grandparents who had prayed the rosary for decades confessed that there were certain holy objects they could not bring themselves to touch. One by one, they began to examine, to confess, to remove, to consecrate. Rooms that had felt thick with something unnameable became light again after a single unblessed object was carried out and the house was prayed over in the name of the Most High. Not everyone listened. Not everyone obeyed. But those who did found that the distance they had blamed on God's supposed silence was, in fact, created by their own unexamined trust in things that imitated the light. The cost of holding all these testimonies, all these patterns, all this quietly unfolding purification, pressed heavily on Pope Leo XIV's frail body. He grew weaker. The doctors spoke in low voices about his heart, his lungs, his age. The cardinals speculated about succession. The world watched the public decline of yet another pontiff. But in the privacy of his chambers, Leo's greatest concern was not who would sit in his chair. It was whether the warning would die with him. He knew the church moved slowly. He knew not every bishop believed. He knew some would dismiss the entire matter as pious exaggeration. And he knew, with a clarity that left him sleepless, that the object he had named, the object in so many homes, so many altars, so many quiet corners of Christian life, would continue to imitate the light long after his voice had fallen silent. One evening, struggling to sit upright, he sent for Cardinal Motino. The messenger found the cardinal in his oratory, kneeling, and this time, there was nothing on the wall but a simple crucifix, blessed long ago, and the tabernacle glowing quietly beneath it. His Holiness asks for you, the messenger said. Martino rose, heart tightening. He knew what it meant when a dying pope asked for a man one last time. He followed the messenger through corridors that seemed longer than before, past guards who bowed, past doors that would soon belong to another. The air in the palace felt thick with unspoken things. When he entered the papal bedroom, he saw at once that Leo had little time left. The Pope lay propped up on pillows, his breathing shallow, his hands thin and almost translucent beneath the blankets. Beside the bed, on a small table, lay the same wooden box that had once sat in the council hall. The same object. The same silent doorway. Leo's eyes found Martino's and held them with surprising strength. "There is one more thing," he said. The cardinal knelt beside the bed, bowed his head, and waited. The final instruction, the one that would pass the warning from a dying pope to the living church, from the corridors of the Vatican to the rooms of your own home, was about to be spoken. And heaven, once again, held its breath. Pope Leo XIV's fingers were cold when they closed around Cardinal Martino's hand, but the grip itself was still firm, as if some final strength had been kept in reserve for this moment alone. The room was quiet. A single lamp burned beside the bed. The small wooden box sat within reach, its lid closed, its contents unseen yet terribly known. Martino knelt. "Holy Father," he whispered. Leo's breathing was shallow, each inhale a small battle, each exhale a surrender that stopped just short of the end. His eyes, though, were fully awake, two clear flames in a failing body. "Martino," he murmured, "listen." "I am listening," the cardinal said, leaning closer. The Pope's hand tightened. "Where this object is removed," he said slowly, each word weighted with intention, "in the name of the Most High, my presence will be felt again." He paused, gathering what little breath remained. "Do not let them forget." It was not a suggestion. It was not even simply a warning. It was a command. Martino bowed his head, tears burning his eyes. "I will not, Holy Father," he whispered. "I swear it before God." A faint smile touched Leo's mouth, the smile of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and is finally allowed to put it down. He closed his eyes. Hours later, just before dawn, while the city still slept and the bells had not yet begun their mournful toll, Pope Leo XIV slipped quietly from this world, his hand still resting near the box that held the object he had dared to name. The Church would remember his encyclicals, his travels, his public speeches. Heaven would remember one sentence spoken on a thin thread of breath. "Where this object is removed in the name of the Most High, my presence will be felt again." The official announcement said little. They spoke of His Holiness, his service, his years on the chair of Peter. They mentioned nothing of mass-produced images, unblessed statues, or spiritual doorways opened by emptiness. The Vatican, in its public face, kept its composure. But beneath the surface, in the spaces where souls speak in whispers rather than microphones, something else began to move. The 20 bishops who had sat in the candlelit council hall carried the Pope's words home like contraband. They did not call press conferences. They did not issue decrees. They called their priests. In small gatherings in diocesan houses, behind the closed doors of retreat centers, over simple meals in rectories late at night, the bishops repeated what they had seen, what they had heard. They spoke of the object placed at Christ's feet and the chilling withdrawal of presence. They spoke of Cardinal Motino's tears in the chapel of the apparitions. They spoke of Sister Magdalena's 43 years of night and the single act that ushered in her dawn. They taught the ritual. Examine. Confess. Remove. Consecrate. Some priests listened with a shiver of recognition, thinking of houses they had blessed where they'd felt something resisting prayer in certain corners. Others resisted, uncomfortable with anything that sounded too much like superstition. Still others carried the teaching cautiously, testing it first in their own rectories before daring to entrust it to their flock. No document was ever published with the Pope's final words. But confessional screens heard them. Retreat talks hinted at them. Spiritual direction sessions unfolded them in detail. Like incense, the warning spread not in straight lines, but in slow, curling patterns, into dioceses, into parishes, into homes. And then the ritual began. It happened in different cities, different countries, different languages, but the movements were oddly similar, as if choreographed by the same unseen hand. A young couple, desperate and exhausted, stood in the hallway of their small apartment long after their children had finally fallen silent. The priest had told them, quietly after Mass, that perhaps they should walk their home and see what their hearts noticed. So they did. Barefoot, lights low, they went room to room. In each room, the husband asked aloud, a little awkwardly at first, "Where did this come from? Has it ever been blessed? Do we trust this more than we trust God Himself?" They were simple questions, almost foolish sounding. Yet when they reached the living room and turned toward the wall above the television, both fell abruptly silent. An ornate, glossy image stared back at them. One of the many religious prints they'd bought in bulk at a discount shop that sold everything from icons to incense to dream catchers. They had never asked for it to be blessed. They had simply hung it because it made the room feel religious. Now the room felt wrong. "I don't like it," the wife whispered suddenly, surprised at her own words. "I never did. I just didn't want to be ungrateful for it." The husband swallowed. "We never pray in here," he realized aloud. "We say the rosary in the kitchen instead. I always thought it was because of the noise, but..." The questions came back to them. Where did this come from? Has it ever been blessed? Do we trust it more than we trust Him? They did not smash the image in anger. They did not attribute to it power it did not have. They simply took it off the wall. Before they carried it out, they stood together beneath the empty nail and confessed, in their own stumbling words, how often they had pointed to their decor as proof of their faith, even when their hearts were cold. "Lord, we have trusted the look of a Catholic home more than the life of one," the wife said, voice cracking. "Forgive us." They removed the image with reverence and placed it aside, away from the place of prayer. The next day, they invited their parish priest to bless their living room, really bless it, asking aloud that the presence of God would claim every wall, every object, every corner. He did. That night, for the first time in months, the children slept without nightmares. The parents sat on the couch beneath the bare wall and prayed a rosary there together. The room felt light. On another continent, An elderly man who had buried his wife years ago shuffled through his house with a cane in one hand and a small bottle of holy water in the other. A young priest had visited him and, before leaving, had mentioned a strange teaching he'd heard from his bishop, something about examining objects, confessing attachments, removing what was doubtful, and consecrating what remained. The old man had laughed at first. Then he'd seen the seriousness in the priest's eyes. Now, alone at night, he walked slowly from shelf to shelf, speaking to the Lord in the plain language of age. "I'm an old fool," he muttered, "but if there's anything in here you don't like, you'll have to show me." He stopped in his bedroom. On the nightstand sat a small statue he'd bought years ago in a tourist market, Our Lady, supposedly, but something about the face had always unsettled him. He had blamed his imagination. "I never asked you about this one," he admitted. "I just liked having her close. Or I liked thinking she was close." His chest tightened. For a long moment, he simply stared. Then, with a sigh that sounded like surrender, he picked it up. "If you don't belong to him," he said quietly, "you don't belong next to my bed." He carried it out of the room and set it in a box with other objects he was no longer sure about. Then he returned, sprinkled holy water on the table where it had stood, traced a trembling sign of the cross over his pillow, and whispered, "Only you, Lord. No substitutes." He slept deeply that night, without waking once. In the morning, he realized something strange and wonderful. The low, constant fear that had knotted itself in his stomach for years was gone. Across oceans and time zones, other homes repeated the same strange, simple dance. Parents walked their children's rooms, asking the questions aloud and inviting their sons and daughters to answer, to point, to notice what made them restless and what gave them peace. Rosaries that had been worn like jewelry were finally taken up as weapons of prayer. Statues that had been bought on a whim and never blessed were quietly removed from shelves. Images that had hung for years without drawing a single tear of repentance were taken down, examined, and either consecrated or discarded. Examine. Confess. Remove. Consecrate. Peace returned where these steps were taken sincerely. Not an instant, magical erasure of every problem, but a distinct clearing of the air, an opening of space where the presence could be felt again, in the way a room suddenly seemed easier to pray in the way conversation softened, in the way the night ceased to feel hostile. Marriages that had become tight, brittle, and wordless found themselves able, finally, to speak again without exploding. Children who had dreaded bedtime began to fall asleep without tears. Old wounds did not vanish, but they began to heal in an atmosphere no longer clogged by silent, counterfeit guardians. The ritual did not spread to everyone. But to those who received it, it felt less like discovering something new and more like remembering something ancient. In the end, the gravest truth of Pope Leo XIV's warning was not about an object at all. It was about a trade. The object, whatever form it took, whichever shop it came from, whichever wall it adorned, was dangerous not because it was inherently cursed or secretly demonic. It was dangerous because it claimed, by its very presence, to carry a grace it had never been given. It impersonated holiness. And the human soul, weary and afraid of the cost of true devotion, is frighteningly eager to accept impersonations. It is easier to hang 100 images on a wall than to forgive one enemy. Easier to place a statue by the door than to open that door to the poor. Easier to buy another crucifix than to let the existing one pierce your habits and rearrange your life. When such objects multiply without blessing, when they are bought without discernment, placed without consecration, and trusted without thought, they become, slowly and silently, a latticework of distractions. Not demonic possession. Not spinning heads and slammed doors and Hollywood horrors. Something far worse, because it is far quieter. Spiritual anesthesia. A numbing of the soul. The person remains in the church, outwardly unchanged. The prayers are still said. The sacraments are still received. The cross still hangs on the wall, the saint still smiles from the shelf. But the interior altar is empty. The heart, comforted by the sight of 1,000 religious signs, no longer notices the absence of the one those signs were meant to reveal. Devotion becomes display. Faith becomes furnishing. Grace is reduced to a mood. This was the true terror that drove a dying pope to spend his last strength naming an object he could have safely ignored. Not that Catholics would run to witchcraft or renounce the creed, but that they would sleepwalk into a life surrounded by images of God while never again trembling before His presence. And now, the story that began in hidden corridors and silent chapels has walked, somehow, into your hands. You have heard what many will never hear. You know the signs. The dead prayer. The divided peace. The restless nights. The strange heaviness in rooms that should feel alive with grace. You know the testimonies. The cardinal whose heart thawed only when he removed the image he'd trusted more than the God behind it. The nun whose for decades of silence ended the moment she took down the statue that had watched her kneel without ever provoking a single tear. The families, the elderly, the children, ordinary souls, who found their homes changed after one simple act of obedience. You know the ritual. Examine. Confess. Remove. Consecrate. No one can do this for you. A bishop can teach. A priest can bless. A story can warn. But only you can walk your own rooms at night, stand before your own shelves and walls, and ask the questions only you and God can hear. Where did this come from? Has it ever truly been blessed? Has my heart clung to this thing more than to the God it claims to represent? What you do with the answers will decide whether your home remains what it may quietly have become, a museum of devotion, carefully curated and spiritually mute, or becomes what it was always meant to be, a living altar of God's presence. The choice is not dramatic. It will not trend. No one may ever know you made it. It may look, from the outside, like nothing more than a person carrying a small object out of a room, whispering a prayer that only heaven hears, and asking a priest to bless what remains. But in the unseen realm, it is the sound of a door closing to what imitates the light, and opening again to the light himself. You can continue as you are. You can leave every object where it is, trusting that intention alone is enough, accepting the quiet numbness, the heavy rooms, the prayers that rarely pierce your own skin, let alone the heavens. Or you can begin the ritual. Tonight. Alone or with those you love. Room by room. Question by question. Step by step. Examine. Confess. Remove. Consecrate. He has already promised what waits on the other side of that obedience. Where this object is removed in the name of the Most High, my presence will be felt again. The words were spoken on a dying breath. They reached the ears of a single cardinal. They traveled by whispers across the world. Now they stand, quietly, at your door. Somewhere, a city apartment, a country house, a monastery cell, someone has already begun. The lights are off. The noise has faded. A family, or a widow, or a young man living alone walks slowly through shadowed rooms, holding a small bottle of blessed water and a courage they did not know they possessed. An image is taken down. A statue is gently set aside. A wall, once crowded, stands strangely bare. A priest's blessing hangs in the air like fresh incense. A whispered "Come, Lord," breaks the long interior silence. On a simple table in that newly purified space, a single blessed candle is lit. Its flame does not dance wildly. It burns steadily. Its light spills quietly into the corners that once felt heavy, touches the places that once seemed untouchable, reveals nothing monstrous, only the emptiness that has finally been filled. No cameras record it. No headlines announce it. But heaven sees. The house is no longer just a structure of walls and objects. It has become, once more, what God always meant every dwelling to be. A place where He is not merely pictured, but present. The candle flickers, then steadies again, its small light definitely bright against the waiting dark. The altar awaits. Before you go, subscribe, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and share your thoughts.